Hello ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much indeed for tuning into this short screen tutorial on the civil rights movement in the United States of America between 1945 and 1970. We'll begin, if we may, with the background to segregation and discrimination in America. The 14th Amendment to the Constitution of 1886 technically made black people full citizens. However, this was circumvented in some states with the 1896 case of Plessy versus Ferguson, where the Supreme Court permitted states to impose segregation as long as the facilities that they offered were separate but equal. The first time the civil rights movement comes to prominence following World War II is over the issue of education and schooling. In 1951, Brown versus the Board of Education of Topeka. There was a case over integrated schooling. The Supreme Court ruled that school segregation was unconstitutional because segregated schooling was inherently unequal. However, it did not give a specific time for schools to be integrated by. It simply said that school integration had to be undertaken with all deliberate speed. So for some states that meant as slowly as possible. This came to prominence over Little Rock High. Arkansas Governor Forbes was actually a moderate by Southern standards, but he needed the segregationist vote to stay in power. Therefore, he pandered to them. 9 black students were chosen because of their excellent grades to be the first to integrate Little Rock. Forbes, bowing to white pressure, used the local state troopers, the National Guard, to protect the school, that's a quote, by keeping the black students out. However, this was a clash between federal and state authority. Federal authority under President Eisenhower eventually won the day. He used national troopers, the paratroopers to be precise, to use those to get the black students in and to protect them while they attended. Now, Governor Forbes closed the school in 1958, but it reopened a year later, with demonstrations over integration continuing to be a running sore. That is the protest where Elizabeth Eckford, one of the black students, was met by the baying mob. The Montgomery bus boycott, that began when an NAACP member called Rosa Parks refused to give up her seat on the bus to a white man, which was technically against the law in that state. A bus boycott was led by the MIA, which itself was chaired by a very young Martin Luther King. Now, 70% of the bus users in the area were black, and the boycott went on for an amazing 381 days. Why did it work? Well, it worked because people in the area supported it, and people in the area largely supported it because it was led by a very charismatic, diligent and driven Martin Luther King, who arranged alternatives for the black people in that area so they didn't have to use the bus, such as carpooling. Now, the effects this had, it encouraged Martin Luther King's key strategy of non-violent direct action and organised protest, and it showed how successful a strategy this could be for achieving positive outcomes for civil rights. And it also propelled Martin Luther King to prominence as a national figure. So here is Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King. He utilised the same strategies that Mahatma Gandhi used in India against British rule. He was committed wholeheartedly to non-violent direct action. He was also a fantastic speaker, as well as being a great organiser and fundraiser for the movement. He was passionate about getting black people to register to vote. The sit-in movement. In the early 60s, this really took off. What would happen is black students, with some white students as well, would go and sit in local segregated lunch counters or restaurants and simply ask to be served. That was technically against the law because these restaurants were segregated under the law of Plessy versus Ferguson. In April 1960, a group called the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, or SNCC, was established to coordinate this protest movement, and the effects this caused, it harvesting superb publicity for the movement. They were easy to organise, so were replicated on a wide scale. They were largely supported by students from many universities and led to the establishment of SNCC. The freedom rides were similar. The Supreme Court had ordered desegregation of all bus station facilities back in 1960, so Core and SNCC established the Freedom Rides in 1961 to check whether the law was being adhered to in some of the southern states. They knew that it wasn't and wanted to expose that, so the aim was to create a crisis that would attract publicity and force federal government action. 29th of May 1962, the government ensured that the Interstate Commerce Commission had strict rules about the buses moving between states. Now, buses that moved on internal routes within states were slower to adhere to the change. There was some key legislation passed in regards to civil rights. If you're going to learn about two of them, you need to know about the 1964 Civil Rights Act, passed by Lyndon B. Johnson, which outlawed discrimination in regards to ethnicity, disability and gender. In 1965, the Voting Rights Act was passed, which established a standardised literacy test for both blacks and whites and installed a federal voting body who could go and examine the voting examiners, so they could check whether the literacy tests were being equally applied. Malcolm X and the Nation of Islam. Well, the Nation of Islam were a black separatist religious movement. They saw the civil rights movement as being a movement that was begging for a place at the white man's table, when their philosophy was all about do for self and make your own table. Malcolm X was one of the most popular Nation of Islam ministers who had an alternative approach to Martin Luther King. So whilst he never triggered or was responsible for actual violence, he did teach that it was wrong for black people to be defenceless in the face of violence. Malcolm left the nation in 1964 primarily because he wanted to participate more directly in the civil rights movement, which caused rifts within the nation. So Malcolm set up two organisations, one religious, one secular. The religious one was Muslim Mosque Incorporated, and the secular group was the Organisation of Afro-American Unity. Malcolm spent much of the last year of his life travelling the globe, highlighting the inequalities and suffering of black Americans to people abroad. He certainly injected a spirit of militancy and urgency into the civil rights movement. And in the last year of his life, Malcolm became more willing to work with other black leaders and the system to change the realities for black people in America. While simultaneously, Martin Luther King moved closer to Malcolm's position by saying that black people were demanding the ballot. But there were still differences between the two. You could say that Malcolm's main contribution to the civil rights movement was intellectual. He certainly helped inspire the Black Panther movement and Black Power movement. There was rising anger in the civil rights movement in the mid to late 60s. In 1965, Stokely Carmichael and SNCC set up the Lowndes County Freedom Organisation to encourage black people to vote, and its symbol was a Black Panther. SNCC itself changed emphasis in the mid to late 60s. Now, white people became less welcome, and non-violence wasn't as widely endorsed. In 1966, Newton and Seal set up the Black Panthers organisation in California. Now, the Black Panthers had a 10-point plan and a distinctive military-esque uniform. They established a community police force, community projects such as free healthcare and food share programs. By 1968, 25 cities in America had Black Panther groups. There were race riots in the 1960s as well. These weren't necessarily the direct influence or result of any civil rights leader or group. However, they were the result of quite regularly the result of police brutality, which ignited existing socio-economic tensions in these cities, such as unemployment or ghettoization. Nearly 55,000 soldiers to be precise, were used to stop the riots, and there was $45 million worth of damage caused. 46 people lost their lives as a result. Now, this caused many people who had previously supported the civil rights movement when it was synonymous with Martin Luther King to now distance themselves from the movement because it became synonymous with violence, unrest, disruption, and criminal damage. In 1968, Martin Luther King himself was assassinated in Memphis. This itself sparked some riots in US cities. His assassination did not start the movement towards militancy in the civil rights movement. That was already underway and was already happening. And by this point, the civil rights movement was competing for media exposure and attention with other protest movements such as the student movement, Vietnam, and women's liberation. Now, the women's movement It's a very interesting one. Now, during World War II, many women had participated in factory work and wanted to retain their jobs. However, when men came back from the front, women were simply expected to step aside. By the 60s, there were more women than ever at university. Eleanor Roosevelt set up a committee to investigate women at work. By the 1960s, traditional gender roles were being challenged in the swinging 60s. Now, contraceptives were giving women more choice about when and where to start a family. And Betty Friedan wrote a book called The Feminine Mystique and set up a group called Now. There were reasons for student protest too. Many students expected a fairer society, which hadn't materialised and exposed in their eyes the hypocrisy of American society. Students were reacting against the norms and expectations of their parents. There was the counterculture era. There was hippies, dropouts, and Timothy Leary's message of turn on, tune in, drop out. Now, the Vietnam War began in 1955 and ended in 1975, although American troops had withdrawn from the conflict some time before that. Many young people were called up or conscripted via the draft process. And, as this was a particularly brutal war, many young people burnt their draft cards in protest. The Woodstock Music Festival of 1969 exposed and gave many anti-war messages and gave a platform to many anti-war songs by musicians such as Bob Dylan. So the student protest movement, interesting one. The Students for a Democratic Society was set up by 1962 and by 1967 had 30,000 members. They borrowed some strategies from the civil rights movement, but largely undertook campus protests, which began small, using disruptive tactics. The university tried to negotiate, often failed to be successful. The police were called. The police became less patient. The students saw provoking violence as a way to radicalise others and amplify their own support. The Berkeley 1964 protest and Columbia 1968 protest are good examples of how protest was becoming increasingly more militant over time. The Kent State shootings of 1970 was where the National Guard were called in to quell this unrest and ended up killing and shooting 4 unarmed students, causing a mass nationwide outcry. The Vietnam War, this caused protest in America, largely over the civilian casualties that were caused as a result of the war, the tactics used by American soldiers such as search and destroy missions, which were exposed as being inhumane, the My Lai massacre, the draft, which forced students and compelled them to participate in the war, lies told by the American government over seeming successes, which were subsequently proved to be untrue. The fact this was a media war which beamed images of the horror that was taking place directly into people's homes. Muhammad Ali, the world champion boxer and member of the Nation of Islam, refused to undertake the draft, citing the fact that his religion was against war, said that he would not go and fight for America in order to ensure freedoms for people abroad that he did not have himself at home in America. That's the civil rights movement between 45 and 70. Hope you enjoyed the screen tutorial. Thanks for watching and goodbye.